Hello folks, welcome to the PT on Ice Daily Show. This is Wednesday, so that means it's the Jerry on Ice segment. My name is Dustin Jones. I am a co-lead faculty with the Older Adult Division with my partner in crime, Christina Previtt. We teach modern management of the older adult, the 2-day live weekend course, and also the 8-week online cohort. We're currently wrapping up our cohort that started back in March. Awesome group of people, super engaged the whole time, amazing conversations, and just been really motivated by a lot of these people and have learned a lot. I know it's been kind of that mutual shared experience where we get on these bi-weekly calls and we talk about the cases that we present, and it never fails. Each cohort has a different perspective to bring to the two cases that we typically cover, and it's been really awesome. Our next cohort is going to be starting in early June. But a big theme in these discussions has been the importance of assessments, but also screening. And I feel that is very important in Jerry PT, regardless of your setting, just because we have such an opportunity to be able to influence people's functional trajectories, what their quality of life looks like down the road based on our assessments and ultimately our interventions. But our interventions are not going to be appropriate unless our assessments are absolutely dialed in. So I harp really heavily and consistently in the course on letting our assessments influence our interventions, not our assumptions, which is typically the case in Jerry PT. However, the question is starting to become more and more prevalent of how accurate are our assessments to real-world performance. Does my timed up and go and my SPPB and the Berg that I perform actually portray what is happening out in the community, out in the person's home, out doing whatever they do whenever they leave our clinic or the hospital, for example? And the literature, the researchers are really starting to ask that question as well, and are coming up with some pretty interesting studies that are really challenging a lot of how we go about things in terms of our assessment. So today, the title of this episode will be called "Why Your Gait Assessment is Different from Reality and What to Do About It." But I wanted to focus on one particular article that I found very interesting. We'll take our time to just kind of dive through this and break it apart, but more importantly, give you practical tips on what we can actually do starting today when we're working with our patients. So I'm going to pull this up on a tab here. Let me read you the title. Is everyday walking in older adults more analogous to dual task walking or to usual walking? Elucidating the gaps between gait performance in the lab and during 24/7 monitoring. I'm going to read that again. Is everyday walking in older adults more analogous to dual task walking or to usual walking? Elucidating the gaps between gait performance in the lab and during 24/7 monitoring. So there are two questions that the researchers wanted to answer. I'm going to read this verbatim. First one, is daily living gait, which typically takes place in a complex, cognitively challenging environment, more similar to dual task walking as measured in the laboratory? So how people are walking in their day-to-day life in their normal conditions, is it similar to dual task walking measured in a controlled environment like a laboratory? Second question, about how much of daily living walking is worse than in-lab dual task walking? Our measurement of dual task walking in terms of the quality of the ambulation that's happening in their day-to-day lives, does that really correlate? So here's how they broke this down. So they took participants between 60 and 90 years old, and this is the inclusion criteria. They had to have stable medications, so not a lot of fluctuation in their medications. They had to have had at least 2 falls within the past 6 months, which is a lot. 2 falls within the past 6 months, that'd be a big red flag if someone said that to you in your clinic, or for me, doing home health. But this is what was kind of interesting, is their exclusion criteria is if they had a psychiatric comorbidity, a history of stroke, TBI, other neurological disorders, acute lower back or extremity pain, peripheral neuropathy, rheumatic or orthopedic diseases, dementia, or cognitive impairment. Those people were not allowed in the study. So what we can assume when I kind of picture this person in my mind is a pretty healthy older adult that has some balance issues that's falling pretty frequently. But overall, they're doing pretty well. They're pretty healthy. And I think this is pretty common. This is a lot of people, especially the outpatient folk that watch this or listen to this. These are people that you're probably going to be seeing. They also recorded their MoCA, or their cognitive capacity, the falls efficacy scale, the SPPB, the 4-square step test, and the mini BEST test, which is a balance assessment that Christine has talked about recently. And so after it was all said and done, that was about 150 people. So relatively healthy, community-dwelling older adults that are frequent fallers, but overall a pretty common person, I think, of what we would see. And so what they tried to do is they looked at their in-lab gait assessment and then recorded their gait parameters in their home or just in their daily living. Okay, and what they used was an accelerometer. So they basically took a belt, and then the accelerometer was in the belt, and they just put it around their waist, and so the accelerometer was hitting right around L4 and L5. And for the people that were in the community, they took that accelerometer and taped it at that same level. And that accelerometer can measure a few things. So it can measure step time, step length, gait speed, step regularity, and stride regularity. So it was measuring this in the lab and then in the community. So when they were in the lab, what they did was 1 minute of just usual walking, walk like you normally do. And then they did 1 minute of dual task walking. What they did was count down from a random 3-digit number by 3, which if any of you have tried that, you probably notice a little difference in how you're walking. So they did the usual walking and then dual task walking in the lab and then measured those parameters that I mentioned. And then they did the same for a period of time whenever the people were in the community or in their home. Now in their home, what constituted as a bout of ambulation that they were recording those parameters was over 30 seconds. Now this brings up some interesting points in the study, because if you think about many older adults' activity, over 30 seconds of walking is typically not going to be in the house for a lot of people. It's going to be out in the community. So that kind of messes around with the data as well, and we need to be aware of that. So this data may not necessarily reflect ambulation in the home. It may reflect more of the community dwelling older adult that's kind of getting out and about and walking for more than 30 seconds. So they compared how these parameters, the step time, the step length, gait speed, step regularity, and stride regularity, how those differed across the in the lab usual walking, in the lab dual task walking, and then the daily living ambulation. And what they found, and this isn't too big of a surprise, the in lab dual task walking demonstrated lower gait speed, lower step length, step regularity, and stride regularity compared to usual walking. So the in-lab dual task ambulation performed worse than the usual walking. Not new. We already know this thanks to many people, but Meg Lowry comes to mind, of just someone that really is preaching how important dual tasking is in day-to-day life, and how someone's inability to perform dual task functional activities can really impair their performance and their quality of life. She's been talking about that a lot. Clock Yourself app is based on some of that literature. So dual tasking versus single tasking or usual walking, dual tasking did much worse. Not new. That's been replicated in several other studies. What is interesting though is when they looked at the in the lab dual task ambulation compared to the regular daily living ambulation, the mean in terms of the values of those parameters look pretty similar. So when you just kind of looked at the general mean, not much of a difference. But then when you actually look at the data points and graph them out, nearly 55% of the daily living ambulation parameters were worse than the in-lab dual task parameters. So 55% of this group's ambulation in their regular daily living was worse than their performance of a dual task effort in the lab. I hope that makes sense. 55% was worse. That's a big number. That is a huge number. And so what are the big takeaways from this? They didn't look at treatments. They didn't see, how could we influence this or come up with new, assessment per se. But I think we can glean a lot from this in terms of how that influences our assessments and, ultimately our interventions, which I'm going to talk about on the next PT on Ice. So the first thing, the big takeaways. Testing in the lab represents what the patient can do, like capacity, not necessarily what the patient is doing. There's several factors that go into that. Many people, they're kind of performing at their best when they're in front of us. They're it could be a highlight for them, that they are getting out of their house or we're coming to their home. And so they're trying to be on their A game. They may be afraid of poor performance and what that could mean. So people are typically trying to do their best when we are performing their assessment. That can influence it tremendously. But also, our assessments may not necessarily be able to replicate what's happening in the real world. So testing in, our assessments sometimes, and I would say usually represents what the patient can do, not necessarily what the patient is doing in the real world. And that's something that we need to acknowledge and account for in our assessments. The second thing, which is nothing new, but for some of you that aren't aware of this, dual tasking impairs performance for many older adults. You will probably feel this yourself. If you do a timed up and go, so you're sitting in a standard chair, you walk 10 feet, turn around, come back and sit down, do it as fast as you can, and time it. Then do it again and count down from 103 by 3, for example. And then compare that time. There's probably going to be a little bit of a difference, and that's even more dramatic in older adults. So I think the dual tasking is something that many of us may not necessarily be assessing, so we need to incorporate that at a minimum when we are assessing older adults. So some great tests to do that. Christina talked about the mini best test. I think that was a few weeks ago. The dynamic gait index, DGI, or even a dual task tug are some good functional measures that will look at how layering on that cognitive component, how that impacts motor output and performance. Get an idea of how that influences people's performance, and that can also influence your interventions. So add that into your assessment. Layer on that cognitive component. So mini best test, DGI, dual task tug are 3 simple, great ways that you can do that starting today. Then third, a dual tasking assessment may not even represent 55% of the demand of daily ambulation. So even that mini best test, for example, may not even represent that 55% of that daily ambulation where people are performing worse when they're not in that controlled lab. So we're likely leaving a lot on the table in terms of information that we're gathering with this assessment. So this is where I'm really going to encourage you, the outpatient therapist, to kind of put your home health hat on, because me as a home health therapist, I'm walking throughout the house. I'm having them show me how they get in and out of bed, how they get on off the toilet, how they get in and out of their tub, how they get in and out of their house, how do they walk down those steps, how they get on that sidewalk, how they get in and out of their car. I know you don't have that luxury, Mr. or Mrs. Outpatient Therapist, but try and simulate those real-world activities so you can get an idea of how they're actually performing. It's very different than a simple timed up and go or you observing their gait pattern walking down the hallway to the treatment room or the evaluation room. Add on that complexity, that real-world complexity of having to manage a car door, for example, or manage a curb, or be able to look out for traffic as they're about to cross a street. Some of those things that make things much more complex and nuanced, but you can get a lot of information of how they're actually performing when they're not in your nice, controlled outpatient environment. Think like a home health therapist. So whether it's some type of obstacle course, whether it's taking them outside, crossing a street, performing activities while they're ambulating, making sure you're talking to them or having to do some of that sequential counting, something. Layer on that cognitive component with your assessment that will give you some information. That can also inform your treatments and what you're going to do, because we know we can improve performance with dual tasking by performing more dual tasking, i.e. the Clock Yourself app, among many other things. And we're going to talk about some of that research on the next PT on Ice. So those are the big things. This was a very interesting study. It makes me think, again, about my assessments and what I'm leaving on the table. But our assessments may not match reality, especially when we're talking about gait. And we need to really think about that and account for that and really challenge people and simulate their real-world activities and demands as much as we can when we're doing our assessments, and that can ultimately inform our treatment. So we'll talk about treatments and interventions, in particular to dual tasking on the next PT on Ice, but I just wanted to start there for y'all. So thank you for listening. PTOnIce.com. I encourage you to go there so you can see where we're going to be teaching, but get on that Hump Day Hustling email. Every Wednesday The faculty shares their most pertinent research or blog articles or just things that were interesting for the work that we do. And Jeff writes up a very succinct email and links those out. And it's just very concise and efficient and has a lot of value. So go to the bottom of ptonice.com, sign up for the Hump Day Hustling email. I encourage you to do that. Otherwise, I will talk to y'all in a couple weeks. Take care.
Hey, thanks for tuning in to the PT on Ice Daily Show. If you enjoyed this content, head on over to iTunes and leave us a review. And be sure to check us out on Facebook and Instagram at the Institute of Clinical Excellence. If you're interested in getting plugged into more ICE content on a weekly basis while earning CEUs from home, check out our virtual ICE online mentorship program at ptonice.com. While you're there, sign up for our Hump Day Hustling newsletter for a free email every Wednesday morning with our top 5 research articles and social media posts that we think are worth reading. Head over to ptonice.com and scroll to the bottom of the page to sign up.